Well, welcome everyone who's here now. I know there's more who's going to just stream in. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment. And if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to get to them. Obviously, either immediately or at the end. But let me start by introducing three amazing panelists. I was just telling my friend how incredible it is that these three people are joining me tonight. Kaylee Bell, who's the director of secondary school admissions at St. Bernard's, and VCS, and Bill Hill, who's the director of placement at VCS, Village Community School, and Leslie Cooper, who has extensive admissions backgrounds at Riverdale, Cathedral, and now she is a private counselor. So I'm excited to talk to our panelists tonight. I have so many questions, and our goal is really to give you an overview of the sort of private admissions process to help you understand the ins and outs, answer some of your questions, assuage some of your fears, and help you organize the process so that it's more manageable for you and for your, probably seventh grader, though we'll get to that as well. So let's dive right in. So Kaylee, I want to start with you. If you're a seventh grade parent or a seventh grader at St. Bernard's right now, what does this process look like? How does it start? Where do you start with a seventh grader when they're looking at applying for high schools?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. It's a long journey. So starting now might feel very overwhelming, but I think, I'd encourage all families just to know that it's going to be about a year process, maybe a little less. And so we can start at the beginning and be very broad, and that's okay. So some of the questions I ask my families are, what are you looking for in a high school? And again, that's a very broad, open-ended question, and that can be hard for some people. But to break that down, I say, what has worked at St. Bernard's and what has not worked. So the idea is when your child is moving to a new school, whatever year that is, do you want to continue what he's already known, or is he ready for something different? And that can mean one of two things. That can mean he either is so overwhelmed that he wants to dial it back and wants, to have kind of a different, more gentler experience. For example, that's one side. The other thing could be just because he's done well, say, in a more traditional school, that doesn't mean he might be best suited for a traditional high school. He actually might be ready for something more. And so I think knowing your child very well is key here, and asking the difficult questions can help you get to those answers. So asking what hasn't worked well and really figuring out why that might be. It can be tough because there's a little self-reflection involved there, but I think in the end, you're going to end up with hopefully some good choices and the best place for your child.
So that's just the very beginning of the process, starting to ask the question of what worked so far for your child, and and how can that continue? What hasn't worked? How can we find the right fit for high school? Before we move on in the process, Bill, do you want to speak to that beginning of the process, how it works for you, how you sort of think of it and how parents think of it?
Sure. In fact, I had what I would call my kickoff meeting with my seventh grade parents last night. My team, I have 3 other people who help out with high school placement, though I'm the point person. And we were all in the Zoom with parents last night. We also had some present 8th grade parents and some present 8th graders speaking about, they actually did the heavy lifting in the session last night, and they were amazing because the parents were there to help, the 8th grade parents were there to help the 7th grade parents understand some things, and the 8th graders were there to help the 7th grade parents understand some things. So that was, to me, that was a great way to get things going. Similar to what Kaylee was saying, part of sort of the mantra that we intone throughout almost all of May, April and May, and then again September and October, is cast a wide net. Look as broadly as you possibly can. There are so many options out there for you, both in terms of day schools in New York as well as boarding schools, and we want to, and there's VCS is a co-ed school. So do you want to continue in a co-ed school? There are single-sex schools. You should consider those as well. VCS tends to be more on the progressive side. It's similar to what Kaylee was saying. Did you like what did you like about the VCS atmosphere? Is there anything there that worked for you? Is there anything that you would like to switch up? And we start, it's basically taking an inventory, if you will, of a lot of the things both the parents and students, but mostly the students seem to be interested in, because we want the 7th graders, soon to be 8th graders, to take the lead in the process. And we make that very much a part of virtually everything we talk about to the parents and the 7th graders, soon to be 8th graders, that the kids need to take the lead, the kids need to take the lead, the kids need to take the lead. And then we, as you know, we'll talk about what testing options are, what things they might want to consider doing for the summer. I will eventually meet with the parents, and I will eventually meet with the students. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on, which is great for me anyway, in April and May, to get to know the 7th graders and to then hear more and more about them, and for them then to start doing research online, spring open houses, all those sorts of things.
Great. So we're both talking about that, casting that that net widely at the beginning and being open and exploring all the things that work. Leslie, other pieces of that early process in the spring of 7th grade for many parents that you do when you're working with students privately?
Right, basically the same thing Bill and Kaylee are doing. What I do like to do, if they start in the spring, which hopefully some don't start until later,
Sure.
to meet with them, to meet with the students. Sometimes they're trying to do it without mom and dad there, so they can be completely open with me. I impress upon them what it looks like a maze, and like, I'll never get through this. Let's just do one step at a time. It sometimes helps relieve the anxiety for the parents, I think, more than the student. And I just encourage a wide net. This is research. And when I have worked with some K-8 families. I had 4 of them this year, which I was surprised. And what I do and think is really important, having been a placement director, I want to work in tandem. I am not there to sabotage a K-8 placement director. In my mind, they have the final say. And advocating, they have the final say. So we don't duplicate work. And I think the other thing that I'd like to say is that I'm here for them 24/7. If they want to call me on Sunday at not too late, at 8 or 9, I'm here, or 7 in the morning. And I love helping them find a school. And I say, listen to your stomach. There are in the spring some open houses that might be, hopefully this spring it'll be in person. If not, to go to the webinar. I don't know if they're having the uptown West Side Fair anymore, or the one downtown, Bill. No, I thought those were wonderful. I like to find out
Not
also.
yet, not yet.
Not yet. What the student is most anxious about. Usually it's the interview. And I also try and tell parents, if they're, oh my God, my child, what am I going to do? So much growth happens between 7th and 8th grade. And I think especially for boys, I don't want to be sexist, but I think there's a lot of growth there, and that sometimes helps to come. But I am the student's advocate, and I'm there for the parents.
Great. So let's we're starting this process of picking a high school, right? And it's a journey, and it's a process of discovering and visiting and all of those things. But before we get to sort of the tour and visiting and all of that stuff, I kind of want to give an overview of the typical requirements for an application. So Kelly, like if you're applying to just, a bunch of day schools and a couple boarding schools, what are they overwhelmingly going to be asking for when the parent submits? And when does that even happen? When does all this happen? When do you submit applications?
Right. So applications are often due around January 15th. It can be earlier for the city, so I would pay attention to those dates. But boarding is almost always January 15th or February 1st. And the biggest parts, and this will be, the fall is a very busy time, the fall of 8th grade, and just what Bill and Leslie were saying earlier. Spring of 7th grade is, you kind of are sending feelers out and you're exploring options, and then you get, you're away for the summer, you get back and you really buckle down. And so you're going to be spending those fall months working on the important pieces. So whether it's student writing, you're going to your interviews, studying for the SATs, which we'll probably touch on later because that's not always required, and getting to know your teachers, because teacher recommendations are a huge part of this application. And, you want to have your teachers know you very well so they can write really well about you. I'm missing a transcript, of course, which is grades. So that's the other piece. What I often say to 7th grade families is, the most important thing right now, even more than going to those spring tours, is focusing on grades. If he's going to be out every single night because he's going to these tours, but he's not doing his science homework, I mean, that's a problem. So yes, I do encourage the tours, but grades always come first, because it's not just 8th grade that they're looking at 7th.
And are those the only grades they're going to see, 7th and 8th grade for you, Kaylee?
Some schools ask for 6th. It's been a little interesting with COVID, where they do actually want those 6th grade grades or comments, however your school does it. Some schools do narratives. I know, Bill, you can speak a bit about that. And in terms of teacher recs, here's the other thing about why it's valuable to know your teachers well in 8th grade, is because it's often 8th grade teachers that will be writing. Every once in a while, they do allow 7th grade teachers to write. So, but not every application is similar. So there might be different, an application to school A might look very different from school B, and that's even within the city, and then you add in boarding. So there's a lot of just details to pay attention to. And I think that's why any of us are here, right? Like, come to us with questions. I know, like, that's a lot of why people will hire someone like Leslie, to just make sure they're not missing anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that's exactly, Kaylee, what I want to do, is to be a support system. Some parents having their older child apply to college, or they just need a little more hand holding, or they just are worried they're never going to get in everything on time. And that's where we can be extremely helpful and supportive of the K-8 school. Certainly for a K-12 or a public school, it's a whole different kettle of fish. So I try and do what Bill and Kaylee do for those students.
I just want to throw in one of the things I should have mentioned, and I'm sure the other two, everybody will agree on this, how organized the parents and the students have to be throughout this entire process. I can't tell you how many times the 6th grade or the 8th grade parents and the 8th grade students last night said, you have to be organized right from the start, write everything down, create spreadsheets, keep all of keep all the schools that you're looking at, what you've done there, what the due dates are, what they're requiring, and then a division of labor. I heard from parents last night too, which was interesting, is that parents figured out which parent was going to be overseeing this and which parent was going to be overseeing this, and what needed to be left then with the student as well. So it's constantly being in conversation as a unit, if you will, a parent, a caregiver, a guardian, whatever, and the student involved, make sure everybody's on, almost literally, but certainly figuratively, the same page when you're figuring everything out. It's hugely important. And some of the spreadsheets that I got to see from parents this year were amazingly impressive, just how detailed they were, and how easy it was for everybody to figure out what was going on and when. So that's one of the things I would throw out there as a suggestion.
You should clone those take out the names and let parents use those spreadsheets.
I always want to hire those parents in my office.
Unbelievable.
Put up a calendar and see, when my test is, and when my essay, and when I should be really just focused on schoolwork, when I have time to do an interview. So everybody sees it, absolutely. But now everybody does it on a spreadsheet, which I wouldn't know how to do.
Well,
I do.
Go ahead, Kaylee.
Can I add one thing about the applications, particularly in the city school? So in the city schools, there's something called Part 1 and Part 2, and that can be confusing to some families. You have to complete Part 1 of the application, which is often biographical information and scheduling an interview. And I believe that's really it, but they call that Part 1. And then once you've done your interview, and that tends to be done by November 15th. So that comes earlier. But when they say, the application's due November 15th, they're just meaning those parts. Part 2 will come later, January 8th, January 6th, whatever it tends to be, or January 15th. And that's when you're calling in kind of the outside people. You're requesting transcripts, you're asking your teachers for recommendations, and you're doing your student writing and testing if you need to do that. So that is sort of city specific. Go ahead, Bill, sorry.
I would guess also things like the recommendations, the transcripts, all of that, the schools take care of sending that out. Like I collected all the recommendations, I collected the transcripts and everything, and we sent that out as a packet. So that's something that we took care of. And I think most schools who are in this, at 8th grade, there'll be somebody or somebodies who are in charge of what I call the official paperwork from the school.
Also, with the common applications that's parent on the individual school portals, you can check and be sure that teacher has gotten it. It's checked off, which is nice. So they have a way of checking, especially if there's not somebody like a Kaylee or a Bill, to be sure that the teacher referenced it, recommendations and grades, et cetera, are there. So
I'm just gonna,
once you use the common application, which most of these schools have, it takes a little while to get used to it, but then it works really nicely.
we're going to get into that. I just wanted to back up for 1 second because there's so much information here. So I just wanted to reiterate, you are all talking about some things that are common to a lot of these applications. Transcripts, number one, right? How you did in 7th and 8th grade, maybe 6th grade. Standardized testing, we're going to come back to that, but maybe or likely standardized testing, depending on your list. Recommendations, probably from 8th grade teachers, right?
English and math.
And
Yeah.
specifically an English teacher and your math teacher,
Yes,
right?
still, unfortunately, as a former English teacher, I think
Because
it
you
could
had to
be
write
English
all
and-
the recommendations.
I wish it would be humanities, and
Right.
that would be better. But yes, and then there'll be an advisor, or counselor, or division head recommendation as well.
And there's more that we haven't talked about. So we've hit on grades, we've hit on recommendations. We will come back to testing, and we are talking about the Common App, which we're going to come back to as well. But what I guess the next question is, well, then what's different about these applications? Is there a Common App? Because the answer is sort of a few common apps, a few common apps. But really, okay, if there are some things that everyone asks for, then where does it diverge? Where is St. Anne's different than Trinity is different than Andover? And how does a student present their extracurriculars in the application process? Bill, do you want to sort of start with what might be different from what school to school? If
Sure.
some things are the same?
Well, one of the, Kaylee was absolutely right to point out there's part 1 and part 2 for the city schools, and part 1 is much shorter than part 2, and you have to complete part 1 before most of these places will grant you an interview slot. So that's important to keep in mind. Part 1 needs to be submitted with the, the fee for the application before they then will allow you to sign up for an interview. Okay, that's
And that interview and the tour usually go together, if not always.
If they let you in the building.
If they let you tour. And there's lots of kids strategically do their favorite schools last in that interview process, right? Or is middle, or they not their first.
Right, but if they get to pick their interview slot, that happened. It was a slightly different process this year, from what I understand, from what it's been in the past, where they assigned you a slot. Now, if that didn't work, then you could call and say that's not going to work and try to figure it out that way. But I think more schools seem to be moving towards this is what we've given you, and then if it's not going to work, you can call. So you might not have as much selection at that point. Then part 2 also includes essays. And that's one of the things, right, that the students will work on. And one of the things we stress at VCS is that those essays have to be the students' work. The admissions people will sniff out an essay by committee. So they'll know if an English teacher, if a parent, if an uncle, all well-intentioned, had too many fingerprints on that essay, it will hurt the students' chances at that school. So it's really important for parents to keep in mind that you may want to really micromanage the writing of those essays. You can't. You can cast a quick look over it for proofreading and all that sort of thing, but be very, very, very minimal in the amount of editing and suggestions you're going to make on the essays. And that is one of the differences from school to school. Some schools will require extra essays that the students have to fill out, just like they will also require some some tests, not even the placement tests after they've already gone there, some extra tests in math or English that they have to work on as well. So those things are the little wrinkles that come along after you've started the main part of what you call the common part of the application. There's different schools have little different extras, if you will, that they will require.
I think it's also important to know that the essays that the students send in are often compared to the SSAT or IC essay that is done under time with no mama or anybody or Haley or me or Bill there. So I think that's a good thing to help parents realize not to you're right, read it through, see if there's some really glaring things, brainstorm about it. These essays topics don't change dramatically from year to year. They do change. We spent some time in the summer just letting kids know to think about as whatever they're doing, what they might be at, like a challenge or something creative, that topics that I have taken from past and let them see, so they have a sense. And it also helps them with interviewing, I think.
So let's get into the essays. We'll come back to interviews, but I want to hear, Kaylee, from all three of you, what are the essays that do not work, and what are the common things? Go ahead.
I'm happy to answer that in a moment. Can I say one
Sure.
thing about student essays? And this also goes along with student interviews in the era of Zoom interviews. So I would just say, trust your child.
Yeah,
So trust that your child knows how to write and will do their best work, and trust that your child can answer a question. Like, I've had a lot of parents in the past few years calling me and saying, oh my God, I listened to his interview and he said like too many times. I can't believe he talked, he mumbled. And admissions offices, they all know how 8th grade, 9th grade, if you're looking at boarding, they get this age. And I think sometimes parents just aren't familiar with that, sort of how they are with adults, or how their writing really is when it's raw. And that's okay, because this is going to high school. We don't need to polish anything for college. We don't need to make someone who he or she or they is not, right? So trust your child, because it does show through. Offices can often tell when something has been doctored a bit too much. And as Leslie said, they do compare to SSAT writing quite often.
Well, and on a fundamental level, sorry, I want to come back to the question about the essays, but on a fundamental level, what we haven't we started with is that we're looking for the right fit for your child, right? And finding a school where they will not thrive does no one any service, and certainly not in terms of college admissions later. And so it's also really about finding a school that actually makes sense for you. And that is through the essays and the applications.
The name of the game, in my opinion. The name of the game is finding the right school where your child is willing to raise his or her hand, even if they're not sure of the answer, where they will take on new challenges, where they will grow in confidence and learn to be articulate citizens of the world, all of that. But mainly listen to your stomach, we always say, when the decision comes of which of the schools they are ultimately going to accept, who've accepted them.
Yeah, I say the same thing. Trust your gut. You got to trust your gut at some point. You can over-analyze it. You can over-intellectualize it. You can do all the pros and cons, but you got to trust your gut after a certain point.
Absolutely.
All right, Kaylee, tell me about those essay pitfalls that you just see over and every year. You see the same thing. What are they?
I will tell you something that's popped up more recently is the sort of, okay, well, I'll go to the SSAT, because we just actually gave this to our guys on last Friday. And the SSAT will give two options. They give a sort of open-ended creative side, and they give an analytical piece. Something we've seen in the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years has been the open-ended, where it's something like, she was looking around the corner. The boys kind of turn it to this dark, edgy. I think they're trying to be creative, right?
Yes.
It turns gory, and we've had a few calls of, what's wrong with this kid? Like, why did he write about a body being stuck in a trash can? Was one year, and I was like, oh my God, he's not like that. But the problem is, you're starting from behind when you're talking with a school about a child, and they already have in their mind the wrong impression. So I think we always say, I don't know if it's from video games, like some people say that, but I would say the whole writing about what you know, do that. So, if you write about maybe some kind of personal anecdote, or with the analytical piece, they sometimes have books, or they had, like this past week, they had a character in a book, how you would relate that to being a friend of yours. Go with that and just play it safe, because when things are taken out of context, admissions offices, they won't give you the benefit of the doubt. So, they're reading through so many essays, and they're dealing with so many applications, that you don't want to start from behind from the beginning, because you'll never
stay away from over polished parental essays, and stay away from murder mystery creative writing.
Yeah.
Bill?
Stay away from trashing other things as well.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
or careful. Teachers, when you come for
teachers, your school, your
that
parents.
brings us to the interview, right? Yeah. So that brings us to the interview, right? Which is, it shows up in the essays, of course, but the essays,
in the interview,
right. So let's talk about the interview. Well, how important is it in the process overall? And I'd love to hear what y'all think in general. What are the most important things to a high school? Are they the same from Riverdale to Grace Church to Andover? Are they different? But also, when a child goes to interview, how can you best prepare a child to thrive in that context? Leslie, do you want to start with how you kind of work with kids around the interview
Sure.
process, and then we can
Yeah.
all share?
What we do, which I think they probably do at VCS and at St. Bernard's, perhaps we do it a little more often. We give a student a minimum of 2 interviews, but usually it's 3. I'll do 1 or 2, and then I like to have one of our other, we're a very small little, we call it boutique firm. So we all help each other, which I think is special about VJB. So that the child has a sense that not every interviewer is going to have the same way, it's personality. I often tell them, look, if you like to cook, and they say, what do you like to do in your free time? And I bake, cook, da, da, da. So you could spend the whole time talking about baking, and that's fantastic, and you'll love it. And I don't go to your favorite, which you think may be your favorite school right off the bat. Let's do somebody that just for practice, they do become more comfortable. I had a granddaughter at 8th grade this year. When I did some interview prep with her, she was horrendous. They said, oh my God, what are we going to do? And just continually doing some of the things and making them feel comfortable really, really helped. I think that it's also important that kids learn not to dump on their school or become defensive, as of course the same goes through for the parent interview, which is much more important, I believe, in day schools than it is in boarding. So parents need to I think it's interesting, they should merge what the student is saying and what the parent is saying when they ask you to describe yourself, or what are your weaknesses, what are your trends, what do you look for in a friend, perhaps a challenge, things like that. They're very similar. There are a lot of, I think New York City has some fabulous directors of admissions who are such pros in helping a child feel comfortable that they will all be fine in the end.
Amazing. Bill, anything to add in terms of preparing for that interview? And
yeah, again, sort of similar to what everybody's been saying, don't overcoach a kid. We do a couple of training sessions as well. Actually, what I inherited, which I think works really well, is that I have a bunch of people in this school, and the kids don't necessarily know these people because they're in administration or they're in the business office or whatever, who love to do these interview preps. And so they divvy the kids up, and we try to match the kids up with somebody they're not necessarily comfortable with. Right now, the last 2 years, this has been all on Zoom. I'm assuming in the fall we'll be doing this in the building and in person. But again, I've been hearing, maybe the rest of you have been hearing something different, but I've been hearing from admissions people, they're still trying to figure out, like, can we give a Zoom option? Because I heard from a lot of admissions people this year that they actually liked the Zoom because the kids seem more relaxed and comfortable in Zoom, as opposed to having been on a tour, overstimulated, dressed up, sitting there very nervous. They kind of got more of a sense of the authentic kid through a Zoom. Now, again, that varies from kid to kid, obviously, but it's going to be interesting to see in this situation and several other aspects, I think, of the admissions process, how the last 2 years will have changed what they used to do before we went through these last 2 years on COVID. I make sure they put any other screen that you have available to you. Again, this is Zoom, in another room, turn it off, put it in another room, so you're not constantly checking your phone or looking at your iPad. Put yourself in a room and close the doors so the dog's not barking, the little brother's not running around behind you, because we all know what that's like, having been part of the Zoom world for the last couple of years. And make eye contact, right? And make eye contact with the person. Don't look down, don't look around like this. And take a couple seconds if you have a question that you don't necessarily have an answer for right away. It's okay to take a couple seconds, pause, to think about what your answer will be, right? That's really important, I think. But those are some tips that we give.
I forget how little they are.
I tell kids, if they have something that's important to them, whether it's artwork or something that and if they can put it behind them, so the interviewer can see that often helps them to have something to start, a subject to talk about. Relax.
I think that's great, Leslie, because like you mentioned with the cooking, sometimes interviews can be entirely about a person's hobby. Yeah. And I think the kids aren't expecting that. I think they're so scared that it's going to be about school and why you want to come to this school, and, doing the research about, I had a kid a couple of years ago who was distraught because he researched the wrong school on the way to the interview. And he was so stressed. I'm like, it didn't matter, but in his head it did. So I think it's like it's that unknown, and we as adults need to remember that they're terrified because they're talking to a strange adult. So like Bill, your suggestion of having different people around the school building that they can talk to that might not know them, but who's obviously there to support them is a great one. So if you can find someone in your child's life, whether it's at their school or maybe, I don't know, a person just that you see every day or you come across, like a doorman or someone that like knows your child, but not super well, that they can just chat with. It's about talking about yourself, talking about your interests, and being comfortable doing so.
Which is what's hard for 8th graders.
One of the things I liked about what Leslie and Kaylee said also, you could spend the whole 25, 30-minute interview talking about one thing. That can happen. And part of the reason that'll happen is because the kid uses a lot of specific, concrete, vivid details. That's the other thing I like to stress. Don't just say, what are your hobbies? Oh, I like to play sports and I do some gaming. You've got to use specific, concrete details. You've got to push beyond the very general answer and fill and say why you like these things or what it is about these things that you like. Don't just stop with what you think is the answer to the question. Push farther into all of that. So they're actually hearing from you.
Okay, so final question. You guys mentioned the parents. And the parents are applying the parent essays, parent interviews. Kaylee, why don't you tell me the role of the parent in the application in terms of their actual piece of it, and then we're going to talk about some other pieces of this process. But I want to hear what are these parent essays and these parent interviews.
Yeah, it's not kindergarten. I think that's something really big to remember. It's not the racket that kindergarten is. They really do want to know about your child. So it might be impressive that, you're there in your fancy clothes and dropping, this name and that name, but you're more background noise this time. It's true. And some schools will ask for a parent essay, but they're often tend to be puff pieces. So they're not taken as seriously. For boarding schools, they're really not interested in the parents. They want to know that you're on board with your child attending boarding. They're going to notice if you're on a tour and you're answering your cell phone, but they certainly don't care if there's one parent there, if it's a sibling that brings them. They're not. I've had parents ask well, what if we both can't go? That's okay. That's fine. Or what if an aunt or a grandmother or a sister has to bring someone? Fine. They want the family. They just want to know there's family support, but it really is about the child. In the parent interview, your questions will probably your questions will be asked will be, do you have questions for me?
Right.
And this is about what we were talking earlier with lining things up. Yeah, he did mention he likes to cook, or he said he really loves the soccer team, and you chime in with that. It's not a time to say, oh, but did he mention that he's also on student council and that, they get the anxiety is seen, right? And so just remember, it's about your child at this point. He's entering high school, or your child's entering high school, and you're not the focus that much anymore.
Hey, don't give them a reason. You don't want to be the problem, but otherwise
they're looking for reasons, right? And that includes when you're in the waiting room. And I've had those calls. We've all had those calls. Does he always treat his parents this way? Do they always treat the staff this way? Right. So they're watching from the moment.
And the phones on the tours, they cannot stand if you're on the phone during the tour.
The receptionist or assistant often can tell the admissions person something that's inappropriate. I think it's also, I'm sorry to butt in because I don't want to forget, important for the parent, if the child has some sort of learning issue, to get it out and talk about it, because you win perks, you win special points by being transparent, and it will ultimately come out that your child has extra time or whatever it might be. And it's so helpful to the schools to see if it is the appropriate place for your child, and they really, really respect a parent, whatever it might be. But I agree, don't go overboard. And as I say, especially to New York parents, they have enough high maintenance parents in those schools. So try not to be too defensive or demanding, knowing every single thing that may happen.
And some of the recommendations, sorry, Bill, I'll just say this quickly. The recommendations do ask, how are these parents as partners? I think it's the ISAGNY rec that asks that. And there's an answer about, I think it has unreasonable expectations or like difficult to work with or, a dream
It's
or
a
whatever.
killer.
But
A dream, yeah.
they want to know, right? And we go back to these schools every year. So we're not going to lie.
No.
Right. And so it's just better to be a little more hands off. Of course, ask questions if you have questions, but there's no need to be, ultra aggressive. It just won't get
You
you
should
there.
always have a couple of questions ready, as we didn't say for the student, for the interview, they always end, what do you have? And it says, I don't have any more questions.
Right.
And there's some wonderful questions that can be asked of each school. What do you like best about the school or would like to change? And then you can begin to compare them and how those responses are from each of the individual schools where you're interviewing. Write
So-
down notes when you're finished because it is easily to forget.
So Kaylee had mentioned the boarding schools don't really care so much about the parents. Maybe ISAGME schools or independent schools of New York care more. Here's how it plays out. So let's talk boarding versus day school. Are there children who tend to thrive in one setting or the other? How do parents, if they haven't already come with strong, understanding of what's right for their child, how do you help them make that decision? Leslie, maybe we'll start with you. And then Kelly, I'd love to hear also about the sort of 9th grade to 10th grade pipeline versus 8th grade to 9th grade. So Leslie, do you have a sense of what kind of kid thrives in boarding
Usually
versus
that's
day?
one of the first questions when I do meet with them, either over Zoom or in person, for both the parent about whether it's a day or boarding. Some aren't sure. If the child really wants boarding and the parent doesn't want that, I think that's a parent's prerogative to really put their foot down on that, or for their child to be able to explain to the parent why they want boarding or not.
My children are never allowed to go away ever, anywhere,
Right,
including
right.
to college. They're 3 and
Right,
7,
exactly.
but they're never allowed.
I mean, look at in a boarding school,
No.
everything is there. You don't have to go to Randall's Island. You don't have to go here unless, luckily there are a few campus schools in New York that does help. If you need extra help, it's there. If you want to do a play and be in a team, it's there. But as I want to say, they don't, but if you stay at home, you get mom and dad for another 4 years, which can be extremely important and wonderful.
Or
And you have someone to do your laundry. I always say, I think the way to do it is you have to, it's really hard. Sometimes it's tradition in the family. The parents have been at boarding school and they want you to have that experience or at least open it up to you. I think if you're not sure, I would suggest go look at a few boarding schools and look at a few day and let's talk about it. And some kids, as Kaylee knows, and I know, and I'm sure Bill knows, that they apply to both.
Yep.
And they're
Sure.
not sure until the very end. And that's fine. I have a student now who was accepted at day and is off doing his revisits right now. And I mean, I think I know what's going to happen, but who knows,
Sure.
I will say,
Kelly.
I think there's a myth with the only students who will succeed at boarding school are those that are already independent.
Yeah.
And so I have heard from families, even already with the 7th grade families I'm working with, oh, he could never last at boarding school. But yeah, some of the bigger boarding schools with less structure, it might be really hard for this child. But there's so many boarding schools that have incredibly rigid structure that is exactly what the child might need. So this goes to Leslie's point about having the extra help, having everything just right there. And it also goes back to what we were talking earlier about, just because he's done the way he has in one environment doesn't mean he can't change that for high school. So if the child, has been fine enough at day school, maybe he'd be fine enough at day school again, but boarding could actually be better. And so I think one of the things, the struggle here is if you don't go to a boarding school and just see, you don't know what you're saying no to. So that's an expression I use often with families, just know what you're saying no to. So if you go to boarding and you say, nope, definitely not, fine, at least right? But explore all these options. And that's why we do have the spring and the summer where it is low stakes. You can just drive by a campus and your kids' eyes might light up. Your eyes might light up. You might say, oh, it's actually only an hour from the city.
Right.
It's 2 hours. We can make this work. There's a bus back. Our neighbors in this, on our floor go there, like talk to them. So there's different types, just like there's different types of day schools, there's different types of boarding schools. So they are out there.
Great. Anything, Bill, you wanted to add on that?
Some of the structure that boarding schools can offer is really wonderful. Which the day schools, because you go home. It doesn't. I mean, they're very different in some ways, but they are all, the beauty of New York and the Northeast is there's so many choices. There's no other part of the country that has this many choices.
Well, not to perpetuate also the myth that Kaylee is trying to go the other way on, but I do see certain kids really struggle in boarding school, away from and it's not that they're not already independent. As you say, there are many different types of boarding schools, and there's a gradual shift, right? But I think that boarding school kids from an academic perspective tend to be very scheduled, and there's very little free time in their sort of world, which can be wonderful for a child, right? That structure and that lack of free time. But I've seen kids drown in it, right? If they don't have the right support or they're not in the right boarding school, which I think comes back to what we've been saying from the beginning. This is about 4 years of thriving and developing, not about just getting into one school so that we can get into the next school. And children who don't thrive at Horace Mann or don't thrive at, Berkeley Carroll, there's no, that's besides sort of the goals, all the goals that we have for our children. And I also wanted to note that there's clearly this process. Preschool, you're in charge. Your preschooler has no decision, right, about where they go to preschool, I would think. My 3-year-old didn't, my 7-year-old didn't. But then 8th grade is this, I mean, for me, a beautiful moment where the child starts to articulate themselves as learners, as people. They're not doing college yet. They're not grown-ups. They still need your guidance, your support, and ultimately for you to help them make these decisions, which can be very big, but it's a beautiful moment where they start to articulate what they want in life for high school. And so if you listen, for me, it's like a moment of listening. And even some kids who in 6th grade could not have said these things. So you're just like, my kid does not know what he wants. He can barely brush his teeth, right? I'm like, I hear you. He probably can barely brush his teeth. And then all of a sudden in 7th grade, you start asking them some questions, and these boys start, or girls, and everyone starts just saying these incredible things about their own desires and things they don't like. And so I also want to just say that if you can stay organized and stay calm and listen to your child, it's also a process of discovery, like actual discovery of your child, who they've become, which is not who they are in 6th grade, and a process of discovering what you want for your family. Some families even just say, I'm going to move to our home in Connecticut if we go to boarding school. Yep. So it's a huge family decision, right? Are we going to be city family? Are we going to, and those are decisions you make as a family, listening to your child, but ultimately also being the grown-up who maintains the sort of overview of what's right for your child and your family. So I want to just interject that. Bill, did you want to say something?
Just to pick up on a couple of things that you're saying there, that one of the things that I heard loud and clear last night from the present 8th grade parents were how much they learned about their kid during this process and how it brought them closer together, even though there were moments of tension and there were moments of, why aren't you doing this? When are you going to get this done? That sort of stuff. But they actually started to see their kids in a way that they had never seen them before. And because the parents were actually, as you're saying, listening closely to what the kids wanted, then the kids started to see their parents somewhat differently as well. When I was working at a K through 12 school, I always wanted more of the 8th graders to just consider what their options might be for high school. And it's sort of like what you say, what you said, Kaylee, about know what you're saying no to. Like, go out and look. Right? You still have a guaranteed place here next year. It's not a problem. You're here unless for some reason disciplinary action, but other than that, you're here for high school. So go and look at a couple boarding schools, go and look at a couple of other day schools, and know what your options are.
We like to say, we like to say the Burley girls all apply out, they all look, and they all stay at Burley. So it's fine. They all end up back at Burley.
But you know why you're staying then.
Yes.
You've made choice to stay, as opposed to it's just a fait accompli that you're staying at the school.
And I think one thing too is that 9th grade after kindergarten is the big entry year for certainly the New York City day schools, except for maybe 1 or 2 where 6th grade now is. And it is the time to think about a change, and because after that, for day anyway, it becomes based on attrition.
So let's quickly, I know we only have about 15 minutes left. I do want to quickly address testing. And I want to also more broadly, since testing fits into this, sort of ask you about the shifts since COVID, if there are any. We've heard a lot about Zoom. We've heard about some hybrid staff tours. So I wanted to quickly talk about testing. Some schools simply required tests this past fall, right? Like they just required them. You had to send them as part of your application, Trinity and Riverdale and Horace Mann and Dalton and a whole host of them, Burley. And some of them said, it's optional if you send tests. So Kelly, what does it mean if it's optional to send tests to you as someone who's trying to help these kids make decisions?
Yeah, the optional thing is tricky. The best way I can describe it, and this is how it's been described to me from a couple different admissions offices, is that they're treating testing as kind of outside the admissions rubric. So that means, in the application, they sometimes do have additional things you can send in, whether it's a sports video or an arts portfolio. Now testing is a part of that. I think the assumption is that the testing will be good. So most, if not all, testing that is submitted and when it's optional is very, very strong. So it will supplement your application, just like there's going to be a good athletic video and a really nice art portfolio or music, whatever other additional parts you send in. If you choose to send in testing that maybe is a little weaker, I think the only reason you would do that is because it's exactly in line with your transcripts. And the schools that you're sending it to are not looking for straight 99s. Otherwise, I just wouldn't submit it. So again, if you don't submit it, this is the question I often get is, well, if we don't submit anything, will they assume he's a bad test taker? They might, but clearly they're not putting an emphasis on testing, so they don't care, right? So it's not important to them the way it used to be. And kids can be bad test takers and still super bright, or they can just be not great test takers and it's not, that school doesn't care. Again, it's about finding the match that will work for your kid.
And Kelly, I think you would have said that 5 years ago too.
I would have.
Testing was a piece, but it's changed.
Yeah, I would have, but I think that because of COVID, schools have been able to be a little bit more serious about taking that stance. We've seen it more outside of the city. We've seen a couple test blind in the city, which just means they want nothing to look at anything. And then we've still seen it required. And I think the idea with requiring it is it's everyone submitting it. I have boys applying to the same school where Bill has applying and Leslie has kids applying, and they will have totally different files, but their testing is the same test. And that's how you differentiate. So that's the advantage of it.
Well said, really.
Yeah. Okay. So testing for those who require it, a piece, a way for them to standardize and understand something about the kid. But I think, again, because I do the college stuff and I do the graduate stuff, it is so different than that, right? Like these are much smaller applicant pools. I mean, for the most part, right? You're not looking at 100,000 applications to Riverdale 9th grade. And so what I think all of you have said is that these admissions directors and those who work in admissions, they really have the time to get to know a kid, to call Kaylee and say, this seems off. Is this right? To read the director's anecdotes, to look at the grades, to say the scores make sense or the scores don't make sense. So it is more holistic than you're going to get in college or graduate school in terms of that. So I urge you we can talk testing, as we go on, but it's a piece of this puzzle. And for me, the most important piece, and I would say this is true for the interview as well, for the writing, is I hear parents say my kid's a bad tester, which I think is a really kind, loving way of like not putting pressure on your kid, right? But with anything in education, the thing I fight most against is a fixed understanding of a child, be that, in terms of their academic capacity, right? Their ability to learn math and to grow, but also their identity as a tester, a learner, a thinker. And so I like to say for the interview, no, they don't know how to do it yet. They're babies. Of course, they don't know how to interview. Most 25-year-olds don't know how to interview. And same thing goes for the test. Same thing goes for these admissions. They haven't yet learned how to do this. And the Brearley girls who don't have to do it often, right? They have found it very valuable in this lifetime of having to sort of take these tests and manage them. And so I think the value is in knowing the child has the capacity should they need it. If they don't need it, great. If they need it, they can learn it. It's a set of patterns. And I believe in that. I believe that they can really practice those patterns and really increase their scores. And Kaylee mentioned something too, which is that not everyone wants the same score. So a good score is really relative. To some schools, 75th percentile, which is, by the way, quite competitive. 75th percentile, not percent, right? You're beating 75% of the kids at the private schools doing that test. For some schools, that's excellent. For others, it's not going to help, right? For some kids, some schools just want to see you in the 50s. Yep, you're just good. There's no deficit. Some are seeing 97s across the board, Trinity, right? I mean, so we have
Well,
different schools.
Not always.
there's
But I think
also,
students who are coming from public school see a 75% and they freak out because they have to remember, and we have to reinforce with parents that the scores that they're getting are being compared with 90% of students who are already in independent schools.
Right.
So you take a national score and an independent score, and they can be quite different and can be very upsetting to a student or a parent coming from only public school backgrounds.
Or
And
private
also-
school.
child is scoring, in the 90s, and you're really happy for your child, which those are great scores. If he's getting C's at school, where's the disconnect, right? And that can be actually more damaging
Detrimental.
because it looks like someone's underperforming. And there were a couple times this year with test optional schools where I said, don't send those scores in. Yes, they're great, but that will not help your child.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
definitely stand by that.
Kelly's reinforcing something too. It's a consistency of what you're presenting. The parent shouldn't be saying my kid is this person, and the kid's like, I'm not that person. I'm shy and I don't feel that way. And all of it should be about really listening to each other and all making sense. And the scores are a part of making sense, right? Kelly, like they have to make sense with it. And they can certainly hurt a kid who's not getting the grades to match that brain that they have on the test.
That to me is the kiss of death. A 99s are getting Bs or Cs that are on bad and mediocre recommendations. Forget it. It's
Okay, but have you tried the grammar at St.
schools where
Bernard?
they won't ask for that.
It's a B, Kaylee, for me. It's very
We don't
hard, that
need
grammar.
anymore. We took that away.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, it's part of the English grade now.
Okay. Whew. All right. Well, I don't see, I think there's been some nice comments. Thank you for your comments. No questions. Is there anything, and there's lots of details about an individual child, and I will send out a recording of this along with information about how to contact us in case you have questions about your specific child, right? Maybe some of you have, sixth graders and they want to do some they're trying to get in somewhere else, or ninth graders who want to go to boarding school, or a kid who has real anxiety around testing, or who is, really struggling with the interview. So we're here to answer those individual questions, but the goal here was really to give you an overview of this process where there are some commonalities, right? There's some things that everyone's going to want to see those grades, those recommendations from eighth graders. And then there are things that vary so much, the essays, sometimes the scores, things like that. And if we could urge you to do anything, it's to listen. I would outsource the nagging. I know Bill mentioned, of course, there's a little tension and nagging. I'm all for outsourcing that. But in general, I do think this is an exciting time to have a kid in seventh grade. It's exciting.
Right.
And to find that right fit is just exceptional. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I think you're watching your student start to become an adult. And that's one of the things I really like about working with eighth graders, and always have, is there, as was pointed out earlier, there's a big jump in lots of ways from seventh grade to eighth grade and through the eighth grade year. And this process brings that jump into relief for everybody to see, for the kid as well. And that's what's fascinating to me as well, is how much ownership, at least, this year at VCS, how much ownership most of the kids took of this whole process. And what we heard last night from a couple parents, and told their parents, I got it. I can take care of this. I'm fine.
Beautiful.
Right?
That's
and
beautiful.
Yeah, it's lovely. And it's like the first time that the parents, oh, okay, go ahead, keep working on that stuff, right? And parents are kind of proud of that, I think.
As they should
a
be.
little initially put off, but then really proud of the fact that
Welcome to parenting. Right. We're
Yep.
all like, oh, startled by our kids' development, and then excited and embracing of it. So, I think that's right. So, I am so grateful to the three of you. There's no one who knows this process better, more deeply, and also who meets the parents and the kids with the compassion and the kindness that you need to go through things that are new and difficult. So all the parents are going to start their spreadsheets tonight, or their paper notes if they're working with Leslie, right? Their organizational systems, where really you're starting to explore, cast that net widely, try to be open about what, as Kaylee said, you want to know what you're saying no to. Listen to your child, ask for help from these amazing people who know what they're talking about, and then at the end of it, there's this amazing high school journey, which I think is, you know, such a delight if you find the right one. So thank you all so much. I hope you all have a great evening and enjoyed it. Kaylee, Bill, Leslie, thank you so much for your time, and have a great evening.
Great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Sasha.
Sasha.
See you, Kaylee. Bye,
Thanks,
Leslie.
all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.